Hi, Parag. Great to see you again. Thanks for taking.
Likewise. Hi, Tim.
The last time we met on Zoom was in April this year. It was part of a living room session that the House of Beautiful Business hosted. We were talking about your book, The Future is Asian, about global migration and your views on the pandemic. And a lot has happened since then. Among other things, we had Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, of course, win the US presidential election. And just a couple of days ago, we had the announcement of RCEP, which stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It's a free trade agreement among 10 Southeast Asian countries, as well as South Korea, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And this agreement, this is why we reached out to you, seems to provide further proof for your argument that the future is indeed Asian. So help us understand the significance of RCEP, this free trade agreement.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to see you again. I so enjoyed that session back in April. It feels like, well, either yesterday or 5 years ago. Kind of just depends on how you've measured time. But it was so great to see all of your members and friends up on that Zoom wall, and we had such a lively conversation. And I'm glad that there's so much interest in understanding what the new dynamics are here in Asia. Clearly, if you think about the world's economic centers of gravity as being North America, Europe, and Asia, you would not expect in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of the last 5 years of heavy protectionist movements and xenophobia and populism. Here's a region of 3.5 billion people that's just signed the world's largest trade agreement. So, why did that happen? Well, it wasn't instantaneous. It's not something that was born because of COVID. It's been in negotiation for almost 10 years, you might even say. At least the seeds were in place. It actually builds on existing agreements. Within Asia, you have these sub-regions. You've got Northeast Asia, like Japan and South Korea and China. You have Southeast Asia, obviously the ASEAN countries, South Asia, Oceania, and so on. They've been incrementally with each other reducing trade barriers. But now they said, let's harmonize that among these 15 countries. And that includes, interestingly, as you pointed out, the wealthy, developed, modern countries, whether they are Asian or whether they're culturally Western like Australia, really bringing them all under one umbrella. A couple of things that are really important. First of all, this is not China's deal. China is part of the deal, but this is ASEAN's deal. This is Southeast Asia. This is the weaker players creating a framework that actually benefits them as much or more than it benefits the stronger players. This is absolutely critical to understand, because most people would think that, in the history of free trade, especially since World War II, it's been the powerful Western countries muscling in on poorer ones, force their borders open, neo-mercantilism, and so on. Here, it's the poorer countries of Southeast Asia saying, wait a minute, our wages are now lower than China. Our political economies are more open than China's. We want to have an industrial policy, bring the supply chains here, bring the investment here. We are part of all of these different trade agreements. We'll be your sort of factory floor. And that is the argument that they have won, in this case. And I think, it's also a very important story because unlike other trade dynamics like the US and China, global trade discussions, as you know, Tim, for the last 4 years have been dominated by the US-China trade war. But here in Asia, trade relationships are complementary. No one country has a $400 billion deficit with another country the way the US does with China. So actually, countries see this very much as win-win for them.
So it essentially creates the world's, as you said, greatest free trade bloc, right? It's covering a third of the world's population, roughly, and a third of the global economy. And many experts say, of course, even though you pointed out it might benefit all of the signatories, it does signal basically China's growing influence in the region, filling the vacuum that the Trump administration has left when it withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was supposed to become the world's largest free trade deal until the US basically backed out. So some experts are saying, well, this is rather concerning, right? So the US is losing influence. Europe is obviously left out. The West should be very afraid. How afraid should the West be about this agreement?
Well, I don't see why the powers that have been the biggest drivers of free trade for the last, say, 100 years should be afraid of a free trade deal. Should they have joined it in whatever way possible, and can they continue to harmonize trade with these major countries in Asia? Yes, of course they can. So trade is supposed to be, both in theory and in practice, win-win. It's supposed to be positive sum. It's supposed to enlarge the pie. So let's not talk about these as rival blocks as much as many people do. Another thing is that it's chronologically, factually, and logically inaccurate for people to say that RCEP is a sign of sort of China filling a vacuum, for a number of reasons. Again, RCEP has been in negotiation for many years, including the entire time during which the Trans-Pacific Partnership was being negotiated and ratified by every country that was originally part of it, except the United States, which originally created it. So the TPP exists. It's just that the US is not part of it by its own choice. It's a mistaken choice, obviously, but its own choice. So these were not rivals all along. They were coexisting, and they coexist right now. It's just that the US doesn't happen to be part of either of them, but they very much exist. Just as Canada, because they're winning from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, just as Mexico, just as Chile, just as Japan, just as Australia, which is part of both. And the way you win in global trade liberalization over time is that you participate in as many of these agreements as possible. So again, chronologically, this is not an either-or situation. Logically, you can be part of both, as some of the most important countries on Earth are part of both. And it's not too late, of course. Now, the Biden administration is not likely to join the TPP. The Obama administration couldn't get it over the line. The Trump administration killed the US participation in it. The US still is in quite a protectionist, domestic, buy American, invest local kind of mindset. But there's a huge difference, and this is something that's so important for people to remember. The White House, the President of the United States, does not speak for corporate America. We must be extremely clear about this, right? America speaks with many voices. It does not have a formal industrial policy. Corporate America is investing more in Asia right now than it was prior to TPP not being passed. And the reason it's investing more rather than less is precisely because the US did not join TPP. When your government says that it is not going to participate in this bilateral tariff reduction, it means that you, meaning American companies, are not going to be beneficiaries as American companies. So what do? You get on a plane, you fly across the Pacific Ocean, and you set up more operations in those countries so that you are now local companies. So what the US not joining TPP did is to encourage more American companies to go to Asia. So let's remember, be absolutely clear that there is a sort of force of history here in terms of investment flowing to the most appropriate or lowest cost destination or largest market, irrespective of what the occupant of the White House at any given time does. And let's be clear that that's how Europe operates too. It's just that Europe, with European governments and European businesses, they tend to see eye to eye much more because you actually have industrial policies.
So speaking of Europe, what does this agreement mean for export nations such as Germany? Is it mostly bad news? And if not, what are the opportunities that you're seeing? Since you just mentioned in the US a heightened level of activity potentially coming from business, bypassing government activity, so to speak.
Well, again, this is U.S. agnostic because Europe as a whole and Germany in particular has been significantly increasing its bilateral trade volumes with Asia, pushing very hard for more reciprocal market access in China, taking more control of onshore financial operations in China, investment banks, insurance, brokerage. Europe trades more than $500 billion a year more with Asia than it does with the United States. Now, Tim, you and I grew up in a transatlantic era, right? In a time when US-European relations were the center of global geopolitics as an axis within the NATO alliance, and the center of global trade, $1 trillion of trade. But Europe trades 1.6 trillion a year with Asia, something we discussed back in April, and nothing has changed because let's remember that in the last year and a half, Europe has signed a free trade agreement with Japan, while the US has been threatening Japanese, auto parts, agriculture and so forth, and steel with tariffs. Europe has signed a free trade agreement with Vietnam. It has one with South Korea. It has one with Singapore. It would like to have one with all of Southeast Asia. It would like to have one with India. So Europe's approach to Asia is not 180 degrees different from the US, but it's a very clear one track towards more trade opening, leveling the playing field, promoting European exports in Asia. And doing so, we must be absolutely clear, at America's expense, right? Every time an Asian country's airline sector does not buy a Boeing plane, it's buying an Airbus plane, right? And that's exactly what Europe wants. Every time agriculture, it could be beef or poultry or something, is not bought from America because of a trade tension, it's a win for either France or for Spain or for Italy, or if it's soybeans, it's a win for Brazil, right? So every single thing that China or an Asian country does not buy or buys less of from America doesn't mean it's not buying it, right? So one thing I always have to explain in Washington is that whoever America's geopolitical allies are, like Japan, like South Korea, like Europe, it doesn't mean that you are not geoeconomic competitors, because we are fierce geoeconomic competitors. And Europeans think it's fantastic, this US-China trade war, because that means all of these industrial components and things that America was selling to China, China would prefer to get from Europe, which is more reliable as a trade partner and exporter, except for areas where the US and Europe see eye to eye. And now they see eye to eye in things like, we should probably be cautious about Huawei technology, right? Let's not sell semiconductors or chip designs to China because they're going to steal them, copy them, indigenize them, and then compete with us, right? So there are areas of obvious logical security and geopolitically driven collaboration. That Western alliance still exists tactically in some very, very important ways. But again, the numbers are abundantly clear. Europe sees the trade war as an opportunity, and it's taking advantage of it.
India notably also decided not to participate in the RCEP, is observing it, it seems, and has also offered, I believe, a chance to join anytime if it wants to. What was the reasoning behind India's refusal to join the agreement now, and what do you think of it?
Right. So, it was telegraphed, fairly early on in the negotiations, going back a couple of years, that India was not inclined to join. And the reason is because the RCEP doesn't cover, it doesn't have that level of IP protection around software. And India's biggest export, more than $100 billion a year, is software exports. And India has a very big trade deficit with East Asian countries, with China, with Japan, with Korea, with others. So it wanted to it's going to work bilaterally, both to increase its trade with East Asian countries and to reduce its deficit with those countries. So for all intents and purposes, India is doing whatever it can to get closer and trade more with Asia. It's just not doing it within the RCEP framework. But you can tell from the diplomatic statements of the last few days that the RCEP signatories have really opened the door and been very, very, positive towards India, saying anytime you want to join, the door is open. And I think that was all handled from a diplomatic standpoint very nicely. And it paves the way for India to eventually come on board. But again, make no mistake that even absent RCEP, India is desperate to trade more with East Asia, and it's going to.
So the RCEP agreement has been criticized by environmental groups and human rights activists because it is lacking standards about, for example, forced labor, child labor, and it does not mention climate change at all. So is this a huge missed opportunity and another case of purely economic interests overriding issues such as human rights and environmental issues? And do you see an opportunity to maybe insert these aspects into the agreement down the road?
Yes and no, or jein, as we would say in German. Because the thing is that the trade agreements have had great difficulty. Even the most sophisticated, agreements amongst like-minded states have had difficulty incorporating these factors or conditions in a way that doesn't make them appear to be protectionist. So Europe has been accused of wanting to insert these clauses around environmental protection and standards into trade agreements because that would benefit the high-tech, sustainable, European countries, right, that specialize in clean engineering technologies and low emissions technologies and so forth. So that's viewed as a form of, exporting one's own protectionist policies. Now, so maybe trade agreements are not the best venue necessarily for pushing those causes, but that doesn't mean that they are not achieved anyway, right? So I'll tell you why. Because when Japan is exporting, Japan is part of RCEP. Now, Japan exports clean technology. It's trying very hard to export its hydrogen fuel cell technologies. Obviously, China is going to be exporting more of its solar technology, right? So by bringing down tariffs to these particular goods, it actually means that these countries are now going to have more affordable access to precisely the clean technologies that are going to be necessary to achieve these kinds of emissions targets and so forth, right? So I think that it's important to not view to view this more as kind of a sponge like process and not kind of, environmental interests here, trade interests here, and they don't in any way intersect. Because in fact they do, because as you well know, historically, as countries get wealthier, they take sustainability issues far more seriously, and they can afford to spend on those technologies. Now, as it were, when it comes to clean energy technologies, it's cheaper to be sustainable, right? As you know, with solar power. So this is RCEP should not be viewed as a sort of deterrent or inhibitor of countries becoming more sustainable. It could very well accelerate it, and it should. And even with or without RCEP negotiations, there is an obvious awakening here in Asia that rising sea levels, droughts, floods, and air pollution and so forth are very detrimental to public health and to economic growth. So there's a serious movement around what the next set of investments are in these countries, so as not to waste trillions of dollars on infrastructure that one doesn't need or that's going to be destroyed by climate catastrophes. So you have this awakening anyway. So I urge people not to create some kind of hypothetical divide. When it comes to labor standards, though, I think that's an interesting one, because it's just you have to put yourself in the shoes of countries that are as poor as many Asian countries are. Let's remember that of the 4.5 billion people of Asia, or the 3.5 billion that are part of this trade deal, only 1.5 billion of them are in China, which itself has issues with labor standards. The others are quite poor countries, most of them, obviously, excluding Japan and Australia and Korea. When you're talking about Southeast Asia, these are countries that have a very hard time enforcing labor standards. At this point, it's the penetration of the supply chain and foreign investment that is itself an important tool in raising standards, right? I mean, if you rely only on local companies where there's no scrutiny, no foreign investment, no international oversight, you're not exactly going to raise labor standards that way either. And just by legislating it and having a leader in Cambodia or Laos sign a piece of paper, that doesn't mean they're suddenly going to have labor standards either. And Tim, this is something I've written really extensively about in my previous books. I am a deep believer, and it's not just a belief, it's quite frankly a fact, that if you want to improve human rights in a country, you do have to go and invest in that country. You have to employ the people and treat them well that have been employed by someone else and treated poorly, or not employed at all. That's the solution. In other words, you kind of have to put your money where your mouth is.
So one of the other criticisms leveled at RCEP is the so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that is controversial, because it gives companies from the region the right to sue governments where they invest in at private arbitration tribunals. Is that a warranted concern, and what's your view on that investor-state dispute settlement mechanism?
Well, this is part of the, one of the areas of RCEP that's considered, lacking or weak compared to very high standard agreements, is that RCEP doesn't have these. And so, countries like Indonesia violently resist, ISDR because they don't want foreign investors to be able to win in contract disputes, or to be able to, appropriate assets within their borders and so forth. So they want the playing field to still be tilted in their favor, and that's why people would say RCEP is kind of a low standard agreement. Again, this is all part of the evolution of things. ISDR has also been greatly abused, obviously, right? I mean, if you think about the history of either energy investments or even pharmaceutical investments and what that's done to poor countries that haven't been able to benefit from the IP or the natural resources within their countries, or if the sort of slightest late payment or any kind of sort of perception of malfeasance is used legally to be able to take advantage of a poorer country. A lot of places in Asia or in Latin America or Africa have a very well-founded suspicion of this process. So, I think it's definitely a different audience of people who would be criticizing RCEP because it lacks ISDR provisions versus those who are criticizing it because it doesn't do enough for human rights and so forth. So, the fact is, again, at the end of the day, these are evolutionary processes, right? It is better to open these countries that don't protect their environment enough, that don't pay high enough wages, to foreign investors and trade partners who will promote those interests domestically, right? It has to be viewed as a stepping stone towards further reforms.
Parag, one final question for you. So in this week, switching topics now and talking about the pandemic, the other big news was that there was a second vaccine development breakthrough by Moderna, a US-based company, reportedly 94.5 to be precise, effective. And that was following the announcement of the vaccine development by Pfizer and BioNTech. So you're not an epidemiologist, but you're a futurist. So I'm curious to hear from you your thoughts on how long we will have to live with the virus and anything else that your crystal ball is telling you about the upcoming year.
Well, I think, sadly, how long we have to wait for a vaccine is going to depend on still so many factors, all of which we know. It's just we pay attention to them in a different sequence, right? So obviously, is there a proven vaccine? What type of vaccine is it? Is it going to be one or multiple doses? Does it have to be a chilled, refrigerated, dosage or not? How is it going to get around the world? There's going to obviously be sort of priority A versus B sets of countries. Who's going to pay for it and subsidize it? We know all of these questions already, right? We've known them for months and months. We just don't know exactly how they're going to be answered when the time comes. So, where you are, what country you're in, what government you have, that's obviously going to play a role in answering those questions. So that's going to have a big impact, obviously, on the year ahead. Who gets to travel, who doesn't get to travel. One of the things, though, that, even if you get a universal vaccine tomorrow, it doesn't erase the pain, of this past year, thus far as it's played out, where we're in the midst of another infection wave across the US and Europe. Obviously, there's a tremendous loss of life, huge economic contraction, massive increase in debt, and huge strain on public finances. That doesn't go away. And so whether or not we have a vaccine, I think what everyone needs to roll up their sleeves and do, both physically and mentally, is to think about what kind of economy do we want to have? What kind of society are we rebuilding on the back of this? What role, what obligation do governments and companies and civil society actors have, as a whole coming out of this? There's been so much to learn. I hope that those are the plans that are being made, because it really doesn't matter when the vaccine comes. That is something that should have started yesterday.
Parag, thanks very much for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, Tim.